What's going on today, YouTube? Rob here. In today's video, I'm coming at you with a Freezing Chains triple structure deck profile. This is the newest structure deck to be released for the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG. This also brings back Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, along with some other cards that I think are really neat, and this is what I came up with. But before we get started, I just want to say, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing for more fun Yu-Gi-Oh! Videos. Without wasting any more of your time, let's get into it. Alright guys, let's get on with this Freezing Chains triple structure deck profile. So first up, we have triple copies of Revealer of the Ice Barrier. This card allows you, while you control another Ice Barrier monster, your opponent cannot tribute summon, and you can only use each of the following effects of Revealer of the Ice Barrier once per turn. You can discard one card and special summon one Ice Barrier tuner from your deck. Also, you cannot special summon monsters for the rest of this turn except water monsters. And if you would discard or send a card or cards from your hand to the graveyard to activate an Ice Barrier monster's effect, you can banish this card from your graveyard instead of one of those cards. Next up, we have 3 copies of Hexa, Spirit of the Ice Barrier. While you control another Ice Barrier monster, monsters your opponent controls lose 500 attack and defense. And during your main phase, you can send one level 3 or lower Ice Barrier monster from your deck to the graveyard, and if you do, this card's level becomes the same as that monster's until the end of this turn, and you can only use this effect of Hexa, Spirit of the Ice Barrier once per turn. Next up, we have 3 copies of General Wayne of the Ice Barrier. So, spells and traps that are sent from the field to your opponent's graveyard are banished instead, and you can only use each of the following effects of General Wayne of the Ice Barrier once per turn. So, if your opponent controls a monster and you control an Ice Barrier monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. And if this card is normal or special summoned, you can add one Ice Barrier spell or trap from your deck to your hand. Next up, I have 2 copies of Dance Princess of the Ice Barrier. So once per turn, if you control another Ice Barrier monster, you can reveal any number of Ice Barrier monsters in your hand, and then target an equal number of set spell or traps your opponent controls and return that target to the hand. Next up, I have 2 copies of Genex Undyne. So when this card is normal summoned, you can send one water monster from your deck to the graveyard and add one Genex controller from your deck to your hand. And we have the 1 copy of Genex controller here. And then we also have 1 copy of Medium of the Ice Barrier. So if your opponent controls 4 or more cards than you do, you can special summon this card from your hand, and your opponent can only activate 1 spell or trap card each turn. Next up, we have 1 copy of Spellbreaker of the Ice Barrier. Once per turn, you can send one Ice Barrier monster from your hand to the graveyard, and neither player can activate spell cards until the end of your next turn, while this monster is face up on the field. Next, we have 3 copies of Speaker for the Ice Barriers. So, while you control another Ice Barrier monster, defense position monsters that your opponent controls cannot change their battle position, and you can only use each of the following effects of Speaker for the Ice Barriers once per turn. So if you control an Ice Barrier monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. And if you control an Ice Barrier monster, you can banish this card from your graveyard and special summon one Ice Barrier token. Aqua, Water, level 1, attack 0, and defense 0. Next up, we've got 2 copies of Molenglacia, the Elemental Lord. So this card cannot be normal summoned or set, must be special summoned from your hand by having exactly 5 water monsters in your graveyard. And if this card is special summoned, discard 2 random cards from your opponent's hand, or their entire hand if they have less than 2 cards. You can only use this effect of Elemental Lord once per turn, and if this face-up card leaves the field, skip the battle phase of your next turn. Next up, we've got 1 copy of Cryomancer of the Ice Barrier. While you control another Ice Barrier monster, level 4 or higher monsters cannot declare an attack. Next, we have 2 copies of Prior of the Ice Barrier. So if you control an Ice Barrier monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. And you cannot special summon any level 5 or higher monsters the turn you summon if this card is summoned this way. You can tribute this card and target 1 Ice Barrier monster in your graveyard except for Prior and special summon that target. Lastly, for our monsters, we have 3 copies of Defender of the Ice Barrier. So while you control another Ice Barrier monster, monsters that your opponent controls cannot declare an attack if their attack is greater than or equal to the defense of this card. So not a bad way to stop your opponent from attacking. That's it for the monsters. Let's move on to the spell cards. So to start for our spells, we have 3 copies of Winds Over the Ice Barrier. So this card lets you tribute any number of Ice Barrier monsters and special summon from your deck that many level 4 or lower Ice Barrier monsters with different names from each other, and during your main phase, except the turn that this card was sent to the graveyard, you can banish this card from your graveyard and then target 1 of your Ice Barrier monsters that is banished or in your graveyard and add that target to your hand. You can only use each effect of Winds Over the Ice Barriers once per turn. Next up for our spells, we have 2 copies of Mirror of the Ice Barrier. This card lets you, during this turn, each time a card or cards is banished from your hand, field, and or graveyard by your opponent's activated monster effect, apply the following effects based on where the cards were banished from. So if it was in your hand, you get to banish up to 2 random cards from your opponent's hand. If it was on your field, you get to banish up to 2 cards that your opponent controls. And if it was a graveyard, you get to banish 2 cards from your opponent's graveyard. Next up, we have the 1 copy of Medallion of the Ice Barrier. This allows you to add 1 Ice Barrier monster from your deck to your hand. And lastly, for our spells, we have 1 copy of Magic Triangle of the Ice Barrier. This lets you reveal 3 Ice Barrier monsters with different names from your hand, then target 1 card your opponent controls and destroy that target. And if you do, special summon 1 Ice Barrier monster from your hand. That's it for the spells. Let's move on to the traps. So to start off the traps, we have 1 copy of Appointer of the Red Lotus. So this card lets you pay 2,000 life points and reveal your entire hand. Look at your opponent's hand and banish 1 card from their hand until your opponent's next end phase. Next up, we have the 1 copy of Fiendish Chain. Activate this card by targeting 1 effect monster on the field and negate the effects of that face-up monster while this card is on the field, and also that face-up monster cannot attack. When it is destroyed, you destroy this card. Next up, we have one copy of Heavy Storm Duster. This allows you to target up to 2 spell and traps on the field and destroy them, but you cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this card. And lastly, for our traps, we have 3 copies of Terror of Trishula. So apply these effects in sequence depending on the number of Ice Barrier Synchro monsters that you control with different names. So if you have 1+ Synchro monster, you get to banish 1 card that your opponent controls. If you have 2+, you banish 1 card from your opponent's graveyard. And if you have 3+, you banish 1 random card from your opponent's hand. When your opponent activates a card or effect that targets an Ice Barrier Synchro monster, or monsters that you control, you can banish this card from your graveyard and negate that effect. You can only use each of the effects of Terror of Trishula once per turn. That's it for the main deck. Let's move on to our extra deck. And to start off, we have triple copies of Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. This card requires 1 tuner and 2+ non-tuner monsters. So when this card is synchro summoned, you can banish up to 1 card from your opponent's hand, field, and graveyard. And the card in the hand is obviously chosen at random. Next up, we have 3 copies of Brionac, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. This card requires 1 tuner and 1 or more non-tuner monsters. You can discard any number of cards to the graveyard, then target the same number of cards that your opponent controls and return those cards to the hand. You can only use this effect of Brionac, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, once per turn. Next up, we have 3 copies of Gungnir, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. So this card requires 1 tuner and 1 or more non-tuner water monsters. Once per turn, you can discard up to 2 cards to the graveyard, then target the same number of cards your opponent controls and destroy them. Next up, we have 3 copies of our Dulorn, the Tiger of the Ice Barrier. This requires 1 tuner and 1+ non-tuner water monster. You can target any number of other face-up cards that you control and return those targets to the hand. Then, if you do, this card gains 500 attack for each card returned to the hand by this effect until the end of this turn. And you can only use this effect of Dulorn, Tiger King of the Ice Barrier, once per turn. And lastly, for the extra deck, we have 3 copies of Trishula Zero Dragon of the Ice Barrier. So this requires 1 tuner plus 2 or more non-tuner monsters. So when this card is synchro summoned, you can banish up to 3 cards that your opponent controls. And if the synchro summoned card is in its owner's control, is destroyed by an opponent's card, you can special summon 1 Trishula Dragon of the Ice Barrier from your extra deck or graveyard. Its attack becomes 3,300. Then have the attack of any face-up monsters that your opponent currently controls also negate their effects, and you can only use this effect of Trishula Zero Dragon of the Ice Barrier once per turn. And that's it for our extra deck. And that's it for this variant of the triple Freezing Chains structure deck. Alright guys, that's it for this triple Freezing Chains structure deck profile. I hope you guys enjoyed. This deck is actually kind of fun, in my opinion, and it's actually a really decent form of control. I find that a lot of these cards can be used competitively, and it's just actually really fun to see an older archetype back in the game. I hope you guys enjoyed, and again, this is my personal make. You guys can make it however you want, but this is what I came up with, and again, I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, be sure to leave a like, and be sure to comment on what you like about this structure deck or what you don't like about this structure deck, because I would really like to know. And as always, I will see you in the next one. That's game.